I think now is a good time for us to get started with this. Welcome back, everyone, from your lunch break and workshop sessions. We've had some incredible sessions this morning, and I hope you're all feeling refreshed after the lunch break. We are ready to get started with the final session of our program, a keynote presentation from President Ron Daniels of Johns Hopkins University. Pronouns are he, him, followed by a conversation between Professor Daniels, Professor Pam Sugiman, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson University, pronouns she and her, and fourth-year politics and governance student speaker Taylor Deasley, pronouns are she and her. And now I am very proud to welcome the president of Ryerson University, Mohammed Lashemi, pronouns he, him, to introduce our keynote speaker. We are grateful to have you with us today and appreciate your support for democratic initiatives on campus. Over to you, Mr. President Lashemi.
Thank you very much, Christian, and good afternoon. Canada can be justly proud of its democracy, but we cannot afford to be complacent. Events around the world have shown democracy can be fragile. Many countries have a critical role to play in building a vibrant and inclusive democracy. The Democratic Engagement Exchange supports this work by hosting the conversations and developing the tools needed to ensure that everyone in Canada has a voice in shaping our future. Ryerson has a long-standing commitment to applying research to tackling the most pressing challenges of our times. And no matter what issues matter to you, democracy matters. It's my great pleasure now to introduce today's plenary speaker. Born in Toronto, Ronald Daniels has been president of Johns Hopkins University since 2009. He has focused his leadership on several key areas: strengthening interdisciplinary collaboration in research and education, enhancing student access, deepening engagement with the City of Baltimore, and supporting economic and social innovation. He has written on and advocate for the role of higher education in democratic society and its critical impact on advancing social mobility and educating effective citizens. A law and economics scholar, President Daniels previously served as provost and professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania and dean and professor of law at the Faculty of Law, University of Toronto. He is a fellow of the American Philosophical Society and a member of the Order of Canada. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ronald Daniels.
Thank you, President Lashmi, for that very warm introduction, and quite frankly, for the opportunity to get back to Toronto, albeit virtually. I wish I could be there in person with you all, as I know you would like to be together in person, but for the moment, this will have to suffice, and it's really great to be here. I want to also thank John Beebe and all the students at Ryerson University who helped make this event possible. Almost 3 months ago, on January 6th, we watched in horror as American citizens stormed the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C., while Congress counted the votes of the Electoral College. The images of that day will forever be impressed on our collective consciousness. Confederate flags in the halls where the constitutional amendment abolishing slavery in the United States were drafted, clothing mocking the experiences of Holocaust survivors, a gallows with a noose, the symbolic machinery of mob violence and racial terror. Contrary to initial reports, the insurrection was not a spontaneous protest turned bad, but a coordinated blow against constitutional democracy. This in the United States. It was a culmination of forces years in the making, and one more harrowing sign of the steady backsliding of liberal democracy in the United States, and indeed across the globe. The data are truly alarming. A decade ago, just under half of the world's population lived under autocratic rule. Today, that number stands at a staggering 68%, just in a decade. Liberal democracy can no longer be regarded as the inevitable, inexorable destination towards which all countries march. This extraordinary experiment in collective self-governance is, I believe, in real peril. So the question before all of us, and especially before our student audience today, is what can we do to help democracy not only survive, not only just to muddle along, but to truly thrive and flourish in this moment? Some of this must reside with all of you, the citizens who vote, who hold elected leaders to account, and who fight against injustice. But it must also reside with our core democratic institutions, which includes, I believe, not surprisingly given my life's work, our universities. We know well that the authoritarian allergy to independent universities, with which we see today in the ongoing attacks on university autonomy in countries like Russia, Turkey, Hungary, and Brazil, we know that's a reality. Authoritarians hate universities. And they have good reason for doing so. Universities have been among the most fierce defenders of democracy, from the flying university that formed in communist Poland in the 1970s, to international research institutions like Central European University, which helped restore the social science and humanities to Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and has, under the leadership of Canada's own Michael Ignatieff, fought mightily against the authoritarian incursions of Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban. In my adopted country, the United States, universities have time and time again come to democracy's aid at critical historical junctures. In the earliest days of the American Republic, the nation's founders called on the nation's colleges to teach citizens and leaders the requisite skills for democratic life. During the Civil War, President Lincoln signed into law the Morrill Act, which created the sprawling system of land-grant universities that would be instrumental in accelerating scientific discovery and social mobility for the next generation. And after World War II, President Harry Truman convened a national commission which declared that higher education was an indispensable carrier of democratic values, ideals, and process. The list could go on and on and on of this kind of connection of universities to the national enterprise. And as universities have evolved across the modern era, they have accumulated distinct functions in the service of democracies. When we're at our best, these are the ways in which we serve, bolster, enhance democracy. Universities foster pluralism on their campuses by bringing together people from vastly different backgrounds into a shared space governed by the ideals of dialogue and debate. Universities fuel social mobility and opportunity. Universities are stewards of fact that shape sound public policy and hold our elected officials to account. And universities teach young people the core tenets of democratic citizenship and instill those tenets in them. Today, I want to consider two of those functions: the education of citizens and the discovery and communication of facts. So let me start first with citizenship education. In a democracy, citizens are the bearers of political power, which they exercise through voting in free and fair elections, through volunteering and protest, through military service and meeting attendance, and through debate, engagement with their fellow citizens. When citizens abdicate that role, when they choose indifference over active and sustained engagement with political institutions, they open the door for abuses of power by elected officials, or more mundanely, the enactment of policies that fail to reflect their needs and desires. As I've said to our students at Hopkins, when they ask my opinion on why they should vote, I told them, it's so that their lives, present and future, aren't being dictated by the boomers of my generation. This is their responsibility. that they have got to discharge if they want to ensure a world that meets their aspirations, their values. We know that the competencies necessary to fulfill this role are not innate. They need to be learned, and more than that, I think they can be taught. In the United States, the idea that universities ought to be bastions of civic learning is indeed as old as the nation itself. None other than George Washington repeatedly advocated the creation of a national university that would train citizen leaders from across the country. Now, since then, colleges and universities have strived to embed civic learning in their curricula, from the general education programs of the mid-20th century to the service learning courses of today. The current emphasis on community service as a dominant model for citizenship education in our universities has been profoundly important. This is a good thing. But I also wonder whether in promoting service learning, and here I include myself, have neglected to ask whether our students are also receiving a foundational understanding of the duties and responsibilities of democratic citizenship. Substantive knowledge, not just merely skills, capacities to engage in the community and to do service. I think you need both. Evidence suggests we have lost our way a bit here. In the US at least, levels of civic knowledge among young people have remained stagnant for decades, even as dissatisfaction with democracy has trended steadily upward. At a time of democratic fragility, universities cannot shy away from providing students with a clear education in democracy. They should be cultivating in students an appreciation of the values and ideals of liberal democracy, a slow, sober, and clear-eyed recognition of democracy's incompleteness and failures, and a competence in the practices necessary to improve, to strengthen it. And universities must do this across our campuses, from quads to the classrooms. That commitment to instilling this kind of understanding of democracy, of understanding its aspirations, must be seen to be an integral part of the university experience. Now, universities, of course, do more than teach. They also conduct cutting-edge research across virtually all fields of human knowledge and share those discoveries with the world. And so that's why I want to talk a bit about facts and the role that the university plays in fact-checking, fact discovery, fact confirmation. Beginning in 1876, with the founding of America's first modern research university, which happens to be Johns Hopkins, university-trained experts became integral to public policy making, to advancing human welfare through discovery, and to neutralizing disinformation in the public sphere. Over the past 145 years, at least in the United States, the success of the American Research University has been extraordinary, and in truth has inspired changes throughout the world. And university systems in a number of countries have sought to adopt much of what is seen in American and indeed in Canadian universities into their policy framework and to the way in which they design their institutions. Academics shaped the New Deal and they built the internet. They developed vaccines and established legislative research libraries. They put humans in space and instituted the public health protocols we still use to fight pandemics, among so many other achievements. They made it possible, in short, for democratic societies to flourish. Their successes were so great, by the latter half of the 20th century, scientists in particular had solidified their position as one of the few professions that citizens reliably trust, far outpacing journalists, legislators, and perhaps unsurprisingly, my own honored profession, lawyers. Yet beneath this veneer of sturdiness, real cracks in the research enterprise have started to appear in recent years. From the revelation that a staggering amount of scientific research that comes out of universities' labs cannot be replicated, to the political polarization around important areas of scientific inquiry, like climate change. These imperil the reliability of discovery and the public perception of academic work. They denude the university of its value, of its standing in society, in its role of checking, confirming facts. The COVID-19 pandemic has thrown the current complexity of science into stark relief. On the one hand, we have seen unparalleled triumphs in the speed at which scientists have collaborated to understand this disease and develop extraordinary treatments for it, not the least of which is the historic development of multiple safe and effective vaccines in under 1 year. That is not a trivial achievement. But this was also a moment when science was brought closer to democratic decision-making and the public eye in any point in recent memory. And here, I think the story is a little more complicated. Now, at Hopkins, we were proud to play a role in the pandemic through the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center, which has served as an indispensable repository to the public and policymakers of testing and tracking data and expert interpretations of what these data mean. At the same time, however, the scientific research enterprise has experienced a number of high-profile setbacks, as for instance, in the controversies that flared over hydroxychloroquine this past summer, fueled by scientific papers published by respected journals that eventually had to be retracted because they used suspect data. At a moment when fake news and conspiracy theories spread through democracies at six times the speed of factual information, shoring up the credibility of facts and the state of expertise has never been more paramount for the sake of science and of democracy alike. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed the potential and the perils of an approach to science that is more open, more collaborative, and more accessible. Barriers that once existed around science have been lowered, and science has been brought closer to people and to the world. I believe that science will emerge from this moment stronger than it was. But it is imperative for the health of fact-based societies that universities and researchers build guardrails to harness the power of open science while keeping its hazards at bay. So before we move to conclusions, let me close with this simple thought. I believe deeply that universities are a bulwark institution that are absolutely indispensable to democracy. I know that Canadian democracy is thankfully faring better than many other liberal democracies around the globe, but that does not diminish the need for universities and the people who populate them, from leadership to faculty to staff to students, to do all they can to inoculate their societies from the force of illiberalism and authoritarianism, and to seed the ground for democracy to flourish in the years and decades ahead. To the students who are with us today, we're counting on you to continue using the skills you're learning at Ryerson and elsewhere to engage critically with democratic institutions and leaders and to advocate for lasting change. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for convening this conversation, for the work that undergirds it. And thank you, of course, for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event. It's a real honor to be back home, albeit virtually.
Well, a virtual round of applause. And thank you very much, President Daniels. And I have the honor of bringing in two champions of democracy here at the Ryerson University. We have with us Dean Pamela Sugiman, who is, excuse me, leads the Faculty of Arts and has been a tireless champion within the university of democracy on all sorts of fronts, including bringing in people from lots of different backgrounds and experiences into the faculty. And so she will be joining the conversation here. And we also have Taylor Deasley, who helped to found the organization that's co-organizing this, Amplify Ryerson, and who led the Ryerson Votes campaign. And I will brag on her behalf that she increased voter participation and on-campus voting at Ryerson by 53% with an incredible team of people and students on campus. So I'm going to turn it over to them and Pam to open up the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, and thank you, President Daniels, for that very inspiring talk. And now I'd like to, I guess, begin an informal conversation and draw on your insights, Ron, and those of Taylor, coming from different places within the institution. First, I'd like to talk about the tumultuous times that in which we're currently living. We're witnessing very intense racial hostilities and then reactions to those racial hostilities in the form of the Black Lives Matter movement, recent dialogue around anti-Asian racism, as prompted by the horrific shootings in Atlanta. Discussions of climate change, pressing discussions, and the inequalities that have been longstanding in both Canada and the US, and made all the more evident by the pandemic. So in the midst of all of this, I guess I would ask, what is the argument for democracy, specifically liberal democracy? And what would you say to those, in particular young people, who are frustrated by what they see as the failings of liberal democracy? That is, we live in a liberal democracy, yet we see the perpetuation of these problems, for example, racial inequalities and other pressing social problems. So let's begin with you, Ron.
Sure. Look, it's an important question to ask, but it's an important question to answer, and I think there is a good answer for that. So, I think it's important at least to start with, for me, a simple definition of what we are talking about when we invoke the term liberal democracy, because we're fighting for an idea that I think is an important one, but it's a complicated idea. And it's funny, in a number of different contexts, I often find, particularly when I'm talking to some of my conservative friends, they say, why do you have to use that L word when you attach it to democracy? Why can't we just say democracy? Why do you have to imbue it with progressive baggage? And I said, it's not about left or right. This is not what liberal democracy is about. Liberal democracy is simply the idea that, yes, in a number of different domains, we allow the public, by way of majoritarian will, by simple majorities, to decide issues, but we put constraints on the exercise of that power. And that's the liberal idea. The liberal idea is that the individual matters, and you can't trench on his or her freedom without doing violence to that liberal idea. So that the notion that we want to, in some sense, have government be accountable to its electors, to the population, is about democracy, but that we say that there are some things, even that the majority may want, and that the elected politicians will want to do, are still not open to them in a liberal democracy, because we worry about the ways in which we can see the majority terrorize the minority. And again, for me as a legal scholar who grew up in Canada in a time in Toronto that was before the adoption of the Charter of Rights, we were good on the democracy part, but we didn't have a sort of clear sense that there was going to be restrictions on majoritarian will. So I say this because when you put these two ideas together, majoritarian will, but limitations, and particularly around minority rights, we think about linguistic rights, we think about religious rights, we think about rights for LGBTQ citizens and so forth. This is the idea we're fighting for. And for me, if one looks at how you make a society work, what liberal democracy does for us is to say, what we're trying to do as much as possible is to support the individual aspirations of citizens to make up this complex country called Canada. We realize there's not one central truth that we'll all adhere to. We can't agree on everything. But what we can at least work to do is to agree on a way in which we can solve problems, find compromise, to recognize that there's a give and take that's required in a number of areas, and we can find a domain for that kind of agreement so long as we don't do violence to the rights of individuals. And for me, when you look at how democracies do, liberal democracies do, when they're well functioning, they far dominate other forms of government in terms of life expectancy, the level of political stability, the kinds of opportunities for individual flourishing that are afforded in liberal democracies are really far better than what can be produced in other types of political arrangements. So that's not to say that given the possibilities for liberal democracy, it's not that it's all perfect and there's no need for reform or enhancement or for addressing certain longstanding issues, whether they're cleavages around race or class or ethnicity. But it's only that if you look at the capacity of liberal democracies to tackle those issues, I think they're far better than any other form of government. And again, it's so important because they start with the fundamental premise that they exist to give as much individual freedom as is possible to the citizens of the nation, of the unit in question that are being governed by liberal democratic rules. So I think, in a long-winded way, what I'm saying is I think this is simply the best political system that we have for ensuring that there's commitment to democratic ideals, to majoritarian will, but nevertheless clear restrictions that ensure we don't do violence to the rights of individual members of our community.
Thank you very much. Not long-winded at all. Thank you, Ron. Taylor.
I completely agree. I also agree that it is important to acknowledge that our democracy is imperfect. And that every system is imperfect. But what I think is important that universities reiterate to students in voter engagement efforts and in education and classrooms is that though it's imperfect, it's still worthy of engaging in, especially now. And I think now we are seeing specifically a lot of young people very disillusioned by the current political issues. They're disillusioned by the hyperpolarization, both in the United States, but also we have it in Canada as well, to a certain extent. And I think it is a challenging time to kind of get involved in politics, and it is intimidating. But I think what I'm also seeing and what I saw during my experience running Ryerson Votes is that their students are a little disillusioned and they're intimidated, but I think they are also realizing that the government is a driving force in our lives, and they're really seeing where their vote goes. Specifically with the COVID-19 pandemic, they're seeing on a daily basis how government decisions impact their day-to-day lives, how it impacts their education, and how all the social movements have really shaped our ideologies, our personal relationships, our education. And I think young people are really seeing this is where our vote goes. This is our decisions matter, and our voices matter in the way that our country runs. And especially now, specifically in Canada, young people have more power than they've ever had. They're the biggest voting bloc in the country. In the 2019 federal election, if every young person voted, we could have determined the result of the federal election. So young people are realizing their power. They're realizing different avenues that they can use to get involved in our democracy. And I think the role of universities is really being a nonpartisan tool and a place for students to go to and engage in those conversations in a way that allows for disagreement and allows for conversations over party lines, and really lets students have a place to learn about what matters to them and give them different ways to advocate for the issues that matter to them, and provide them with voter education and civic education on how they can get involved in their democracy. But yeah, I think overall now we're seeing a lot of changes in the way that young people view politics. And I think it can be viewed in certain negative ways, but I think, in a lot of ways, it's empowering for students, and it's an empowering time for young people to be involved in politics.
Thank you. And sorry. I think I don't know if it's a technical glitch on my end. I may have missed the 10 seconds.
So Pam, I was just saying, I wondered if I could just respond to Taylor for a second, because she raises some great points, and I start with Taylor, something that you said that I often say to my students here at Hopkins, but I used to say it when I was a law professor back in Toronto, and we would look at the voting data in recent either American elections or Canadian elections and see the very significant disparity in voter turnout between young Americans, young Canadians, and older Americans and older Canadians. And I would challenge the students. I would say, say what you want about government and the frustrations that you might have with government, but I think the one thing that I believe strongly is that the people who run for office and ultimately who get elected, I like to think of them as rational actors, that they will worry about those people who ultimately support them. If they know, for instance, that they're going to find their electoral fortunes are determined by a certain constituency of the population, you can be really sure that they're going to, once elected, generate policies that cater to, are attentive to those interests. And I said, and likewise, if they know that there's a large group of citizens who tend not to turn out in elections and tend to say that that's not a sphere of activity they're interested in, they're much more interested in direct service or other forms of public engagement, you can be sure that the politicians will, not surprisingly, disregard their interests. So I said, for instance, if you look in Canada, and this is true in the United States, but if you look at the percentage of the federal budget that goes to healthcare in comparison to education, and look at the rate of increase in those two spending priorities. I haven't seen this recently in Canada. I used to know these data better than I do now, but I do know what's happening in the United States. And it's clear that healthcare is far dramatically outstripping education investment across the United States. And we know, where does the lion's share of health expenditures go? It goes to the elderly. Now, I'm not saying that the elderly don't matter, and particularly as a member of the boomer generation age, I'm thinking more and more about that healthcare issue. But having said that, the fact that politicians continue to worry about investing in healthcare and don't worry about education investment, and are not investing the way they should be in financial aid for middle and low income students, aren't thinking about ways in which they can prop up investment in research and so forth in higher education, or even one could multiply the kinds of examples, support for K-12 education and so forth. If young people don't vote, we will continue to get, the kinds of policies that, not surprisingly, don't favor them. And I think, obviously, the defining issue for your generation, Taylor, which I increasingly, understand to be, and for good reason, climate change. But again, if we're only thinking about older voters, what we're going to find is that the medium to long-term effects of climate change just won't be given their due unless there's a constituency out there that are going to truly hold politicians to account in the polling booth. I mean, so that's why it's just so vital. It's just too critical to be ignored for all the reasons you said.
Great, thank you. Taylor, would you like to respond?
I think that's a really interesting point. I remember watching a voter engagement video that came out a year or two ago, and it was a group of people in the older age demographic, and they were saying, "Dear young people, don't vote. because the more you vote, the less our policies are going to be advocated for and the less our needs are going to be met. They're saying you're doing us a favor by not voting because the government will continuously make policy decisions that work for our demographic. And I thought that was a great point, because that's very true. Politicians, they vote they represent who votes for them, and that's how our system works, and that's what makes sense. And so if young people aren't voting, if they aren't going to be advocating for policies and issues that matter to them through voting for politicians, they're going to follow through on those policies, then our issues and the things that matter to us will continue to be ignored. And I think that disillusionment will then continue and move forward if the voter engagement efforts don't change. So that's I'm glad that was brought up. That was really interesting.
Thanks to both of you. And, both of you have talked about directly about the role of universities in particular. And I think, Ron, you had said earlier, you had identified universities as one of the bulwark institutions that are central to the democratic process, to democracy itself. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you envision the role of universities in democracy. What role do universities play, at colleges play in democracy? And, this is contrary to the view, perhaps the myth, that universities are, institutions in and of themselves, apart from the community, apart from society, and detached, in fact, ivory towers. But from everything I'm hearing, that's simply not the case. So I'll ask first Ron, and then Taylor, if you'd like to follow up with your view on this.
Sure. So, thanks for the question, Pam. So I think it really goes back to, excuse me, what I said earlier in terms of the 4 functions of the university that seem particularly important for me in terms of our impact on democracy, liberal democracy. Excuse me. And so, I think that although, as you think about those 4 functions, thinking about our role in modeling pluralism, in fact checking, in terms of civic education, when you look at these functions, at one level they require us to be a place apart. And require a little bit of distance from society. What defines a university are some really unique values that are different from society at large. We'd like to think that they're present all throughout society, but we know that's not true. So, even something as, for me, which is really foundational for all universities, is the ideal of academic freedom, and the idea that there's a deep contestation of ideas and of facts, and we're really committed to vigorous debate and to checking of assertions and so forth. We know that in other institutions in society that same value isn't as paramount. There's not a lot of institutions in society where people who work in a corporation can speak out on issues that are important to them, to know that they have job security. And not only do they have job security, but that kind of contestation, criticism is being valued and applauded. That's part of what makes for a vibrant community. So we know that that's a place in which we're unique and we're different. And so that's important for what we do, but we also know that by being different and unique, we also contribute unique things to the rest of the society in which we're part. So again, on something like, I'll give an example that comes from my own time back in Canada. When I was law dean at the University of Toronto, I can remember just before I became the dean of the law school, one of my colleagues, someone who became a colleague at Toronto, who was actually a classmate of mine at University of Toronto. Her name is Brenda Kosman. She's a distinguished faculty member at the University of Toronto, specializes, among other things, family law. I can remember early on in Brenda's career, she started thinking about marriage and like whether the government should be in the business of recognizing marriage. Like, why do we need the government to solemnize marriage? You know, if two people want to be together, why do they need to get some act of recognition by government? And, you know, no sooner she started to ask those questions than she started to ask questions about why does marriage as an institution have to be confined, as it then was, to heterosexual couples? Now, like, I remember when she started asking these hard questions about marriage, and, you know, something today that just seems like, you know, we've moved well beyond this on our understanding in, you know, for a long time in Canada, sadly, a less long time in the United States, but we've moved here as well. But we now have a completely different understanding of marriage. I remember when Brenda started asking those questions around marriage and writing on it, I remember the intense criticism, reaction that came from outside the university around her work. And people really found it offensive, iconoclastic. Why are you supporting this kind of work within the university? But she kept at it. She was tenacious. And slowly but surely, you know, what she saw as something that was a clear truth, through argumentation, through contestation, through persistence and courage, it became a mainstream view because of the work of her and others. Again, that required the university to be doing its own thing and giving space and support for her to pursue those ideas. But it spread out well beyond the university and ultimately changed where the courts ended up in Canada, and then ultimately what the legislature has done. So, you know, this is like, I could, you know, again, in all the areas I've talked about, I can multiply the examples where we do things that, because we're unique, it seems like we're a little bit distant, but in fact, we have these deep connectivity to society. And, you know, in a funny sort of way, our independence of society makes it more accountable to society. The better we are at really, you know, modeling pluralism, checking facts, building civic education on the part of our students, the stronger we are at doing these things, the better we are doing these things, the more vital and more relevant I think we become to the democracy of which we're part.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'm always as a dean of arts, social sciences and humanities, I'm a big advocate always of, you know, the value of a liberal arts education. We impart the ability to think critically, to communicate well, to understand diversity, whether it's diversity of opinions, racial, gender diversity, and the importance of dialogue. And I'm wondering how I understand how within a faculty of arts, one can promote, that the kind of dialogue that you were just describing, discussion of the institution of marriage, and a critical assessment of the institution of marriage. How is it possible to do that across the entire university campus? For example, in a faculty of engineering, in a faculty of science, for example.
It's a great question, Pam. So look, I think, even within purely scientific domains, without getting into broad societal context, we know that there was a received wisdom, there's an agreement on shared norms and understandings of natural phenomena that, to go back to ideas of Thomas Kuhn, there are paradigm revolutions that come. And so that even within those debates on pure scientific understandings, there are challenges, contestation, and ultimately, we hope, a deeper understanding of the truth. So, so I think at one level, you want to make sure that you're constantly, I worry about this as the university president, are you constantly attentive to the ability of people to have the protection, to have outlier views, to bring those views to others and for them to get a fair hearing and slowly but surely determine whether they're legitimate or not? And again, for me, it's like, I've learned over time, particularly my background, like yours, is in the social sciences, humanities, and then law. but I've just come to see over time, like the true heroism of people in the sciences who will labor for decades pursuing an idea that people regard as an outlier and are dismissive of it, and only to find after sometimes a period of 4 decades that they get vindicated and they're finally, are able to persuade others of their truth. So I think at one level, it's just that being true to academic freedom and that creating that environment where you're able to have open, fact-based, respectful debate. That matters as an institution. But another level, I think that for me, what I feel also very strongly is that so many parts of the university that are steeped in the natural or physical sciences, even the biological sciences, increasingly have to engage issues that step outside of the domain of the sciences to really make sense of them. So, we now have in CRISPR technology, we're now equipped with the tools to alter the basic genome of human populations. We're going to get more and more refined at this, cutting and pasting, removing genes we do and don't like. The implications of that technology, and the people who've been at the forefront of these discoveries, like Jennifer Doudna and others, have been very attentive to this. But these can't be answered. How you're going to regulate that science? How are you going to ensure that it's responsibly used? How are you going to ensure that it doesn't get misused to remove certain traits that are seen to be outlier traits? Do we see this as a way to ensure that we remove certain traits of skin color or sexual preference or gender identity in order to get sort of more homogeneity in our population? I mean, these are really important questions that we need to work through as a society. The questions around AI and the capabilities of AI and facial recognition software. Again, in the engineering school, they can develop these tools. But when I talk to the Dean of Engineering, he's really worried about what these imply for society going forward. So this is, I think, all leads back to the sense of these kind of debates around technology and how it's used are intimately related to the character of our liberal democracy. And we've got to find ways within the university to broaden the conversation so that people from outside of the sciences, for instance, outside of engineering, are part of the conversation, and students can see, in some sense, the salience of these issues and understand them and participate in their resolution and contextualization. So I think this is a great moment across the university to spur these debates.
Yes, thanks, and that really does provoke thought, regardless of the discipline or the nature of the research. There are ethical, political, civic questions that are part
that can't be dismissed.
Yes. And Taylor, from a student perspective, what do you feel should be the role of the university in promoting democratic engagement? And also, just in thinking about what Ron was just describing, there, of course, in any university, there is a lot of heated dialogue, heated discussion, debate. We like to foster debate. How do you, how in your view, do you bring people together with dissenting views in a respectful manner? That is, in a way that doesn't demonize your critics or those who don't share your views. And we live in what people call a cancel culture. We learn so much from social media, especially young people. What are your thoughts on that?
I think, I guess there's a few things I want to touch on with that. So as we've stated throughout this session, I think the universities have a huge role in fostering a culture of democratic engagement on campus. And I think from my experience with Ryerson Votes, seeing that 53% increase, seeing that high level of engagement really showed that, you know, Ryerson and other campuses are capable of being a democratic leader, and they are capable of really fostering a culture of voter engagement on campus. But it's making sure that it's run in a way that is accessible to students, that is empathetic, that is collaborative, and accesses all parts of campus. And as both President Daniels and Dean Sugiman said earlier in the session, it's important that we make sure that all faculties are included. And although with Ryerson Votes, it was successful, we were able to become the most, with the highest voter engagement increase in the province, and the third engaged campus in the country. And it sounds great, and it was great. However, if you look at the actual numbers of votes, you're still missing thousands and thousands of students. We have a huge campus. What about those other students? And I want to start thinking about, and what the exchange in Ryerson is trying to think about, is how can we reach those students that haven't been involved yet? And I think my experience in the 2019 federal election showed this is what we're capable of doing, and kind of what can we learn from that, and what can we take from the success of that campaign and the success of campaigns like Johns Hopkins Votes and other voter engagement efforts in the United States, and work with them and learn from them in conversations like that, like this, in terms of what can we do to increase engagement. And I think a big part of it is that Ryerson Votes was accessible, and it was everywhere. For 6 weeks ahead of the election, we were everywhere. We were at homecoming games, we were at the coffee shop, we were in your classroom, we were on social media, we were everywhere. And according to our polls, 82% of students knew about our campaign and were aware that you could vote on campus. So there was a lot of awareness, but then if you look at it, why didn't 82% of the student population vote? And I do think that a big part of that is that it's an intimidating process. It's intimidating for students to get involved. Again, with hyperpolarization, it's scary to kind of get involved in that process. And I think a big part of what we can do as a university is make it as part of our mandate. Part of our mandate as a university is to engage students and is to get involved in our democracy and have those conversations and incorporate it into all faculties. And that's something that Ryerson Votes struggled with. We wanted to get athletes involved. We wanted to get, you know, basketball players, hockey players involved. We wanted to get the musical theater program involved. Maybe have an open mic night and a voter registration night together, and all of these things, but we weren't getting the same intrigue from all the different faculties. And I think that's where the top, you know, the head of the university, the president's office, can really be a leader in that, encouraging all the faculties to get involved, making it easier for voter engagement campaigns and students to get involved, so we don't have to push as many organizations. If there's a push from multiple levels of get involved, get engaged, here's this event, and investing in research, investing in funding, and, you know, I am voter buttons, and food to provide at polling places, just kind of going at it from all levels so that it's incorporated into the everyday lives of students, not just in the Faculty of Arts or the program of politics, but all over the campus, to be something that's intriguing and fun and open, instead of something that's intimidating and, you know, a serious long process, something that people want to be a part of and that they fear they'll miss out on if they don't get involved.
Thanks, Taylor. And I'm very mindful of the time, but I might ask President Daniels to just answer one question, which I know is it's not fair because it's probably would require quite a bit of time to answer. But I know that for most of us in Canada, you know, we've been observing closely the events in the U.S., the unprecedented attack on the U.S. Congress. And, you know, as you mentioned earlier, this really has threatened core democratic principles and institutions. So are there lessons to be learned for Canadians, for Canadian democracy? As I said, I know that can't be answered in minutes. But
look, it's you know, I would put it I guess, let me answer the question, then let me just ask another question in return. I mean, I think, of course, there are lessons here. And I think the lessons are for any liberal democracy, you know, despite the long and storied history, relatively short, but nonetheless longer than every other country of democracy in the United States, it can never be taken for granted. You know, it's just not self-executing. You don't have a liberal democracy that stays robust and dynamic without effort and guardianship and continuous reinvestment. And so again, it's not something that is owned by a single generation. It has to be owned by every generation and constantly earned and re-earned. So I think that to me is a lesson. But I would say this is a nod to you all back in my home country, which I miss a lot, which is, I think they're lessons for the United States from Canada. You know, so when I think about just today, we have yet another mass shooting and our inability to get over the paralysis around proper gun control in this country. Canada's moved well beyond that. You know, issues like access to medical care and really disassociating the idea that when you get a terrible diagnosis that you're going to put your personal finances, your family's finances in peril. Canada has long been well beyond that. And I think there's lessons for the United States. So, you know, I think that at the same time you want to think about, you know, the lessons for Canada. I think there should also be a real pride in the extraordinary accomplishment of Canada and the way in which, as you know, we felt particularly during the very dark parts of the last 4 years in the United States, that the example of Canada, for all its frailties, is still an enormously successful, vibrant country. And to my mind, I'll just conclude on this point, you know, and it's a real shout out to Taylor and the work that she's done. You're a new university, that you're doing new things and doing it differently and really kicking butt in the way in which you've done this voter turnout effort and really setting a path for other universities in the province. That's the possibility of Canada, and that's the possibility of the university. So kudos to you all, and particularly to you, Taylor, for your great success in getting those percentages up. That's really something, and it's going to be a living legacy because, you know, once people start voting, they don't stop. That's the thing. You've turned on the switch, and it'll stay on for the duration of your fellow students' lives, and that's terrific. So thank you for including me.
And thank you. Yeah, thank you all. It's a great note to end on. Because I share your sort of enthusiasm for the work that Taylor has led. And Dean Sugiman and Taylor and President Lashmi, all for their commitment to this work. And we all recognize that this work is just beginning. There's a lot still to go, and we haven't fulfilled democracy's promise. We haven't done it at Ryerson, we haven't done it in Canada, we haven't done it anywhere yet. But the promise is there, and I think we all share a commitment to doing that hard work and ensuring that the voices who weren't part of the conversation today are also heard and have a place and have the resources they need to be heard. And I think we have a deep commitment to that work at the Democratic Engagement Exchange, and I know it is reflected also at Ryerson. So, you know, we have a lot to learn. I know I learned a lot today. I know, you know, we all will learn more moving forward, and it's one of the reasons I love my job. And I appreciate, you know, everyone here who is part of this conversation. This last year has been really challenging for a lot of folks. But I want to close with a piece of hope, because I think there's some real hope here too. And it comes from a quote from Greta Thunberg, who spoke, you know, powerfully about climate change, but she talked about democracy. And she says, you know, her hope is that this does not come from governments or corporations. It comes from the people. And that is the hope, because we have democracy, and democracy is happening all the time, not just on election day, but every second and every hour. And I think, you know, it's just a reminder of the wisdom that is amongst the young people who are leading some of these efforts, and our need to listen to those voices. I'm going to ask Nancy if you are with us to sort of jump back in at the very close here to offer just a closing comment, and then again to thank everyone for joining us, and we will be following up with you about next steps. All right, Nancy, are you with us?
Yep. Thanks, John.
Great.
On behalf of Amplify Ryerson, we want to thank everyone for contributing to this day. We have a final call to action for you. We want to know how you will be amplifying democracy on your campus and in your communities. How will you keep this conversation going? We will be in touch soon with ways to stay connected and build on today's work. Thanks, everyone, and take care.
Okay.